forthcoming novel is the Oppenheimer alternative, out next year for the 75th anniversary of the birth of the atomic age.
Hi, I'm Jim Butcher. I'm the author of the Dresden Files, the Codex Alera, and the Cinder Spires. And somebody pointed out to me that next year is 20 years since the Dresden Files started, so it's the 20 years anniversary. Let's figure out how to do something cool for that. That'd be fun.
Brendan Sanderson. I write primarily epic fantasy and books for young adults. And I don't know, what else am I doing? I'm writing a lot of books. So there you go.
And I'm Kevin J. Anderson, and I'm thinking that nobody up here is not prolific, so I think we're out testosteroning each other. We're doing our best. I've written a whole bunch of science fiction and fantasy. I've written Star Wars and Dune and X-Files and comic books and all kinds of things. And I also have an astronomy degree, so I can actually use my knowledge to figure out if these stars are actually brown dwarfs or blue supergiants or whatever we have here. And this is my 25th DragonCon. We just figured that out.
And I'm Michael Stackpole. Everything Kevin has not written, I have. A lot of BattleTech, a lot of Star Wars, World of Warcraft, a lot of my own standalone fantasy, and I'm currently working on blowing out the speakers. I'm currently working on a novel set in the world of the video game Dark Souls.
So we do have a stellar panel here, right?
Yeah.
I want each of you to tell me what, looking back over your career, your favorite novel was that you wrote, and why. And we can start on either end and go that way, or you can just answer as you will.
I think it's going to be hard for a lot of us to answer because I don't know how you guys respond, but when I get asked that in the line, I always say that they're like my children, right?
Yeah.
I don't generally play favorites. Often it's more a question of, each book is different, and each book does something different to you when you're writing. And so I can sometimes answer like what was the most fun or what was the most satisfying or things like that, but favorite, I'm always trying to write my favorite book wherever I am, so maybe whatever the next book I'm working on is probably my favorite at the moment.
Right, but we all know that real parents really do like some children better than others.
And we were all obviously our parents.
Yes, a parent, obviously. I've got a lot of different types of books. I could never imagine writing only one type because I'd get really bored with it. I switch a bunch of times. But there are some times when like the stars align and everything turns out right, and you finish writing and you go, wow, that is as good on the paper as the book is in my head. Because we all have brilliant books in our heads. We don't always get them down the way we want it to. And I get asked it a lot, and I actually do have an answer. The one that I like the best is a book called Clockwork Lives. It's a steampunk fantasy kind of Canterbury Tales, and I co-wrote it with the drummer for the rock band Rush, who's been my idol since high school. And the book turned out like perfectly. It won the Colorado Book Award. I just love it. Neil loves it, and it's a gorgeous book because the publisher did it like with leatherette covers and beautiful illustrations. So that's my honor roll student of all the kids that we've got.
Yeah, I would agree. The books are very much like my children. I don't remember half of them. But I think that, if by the criteria you look at, one, there is something to love in each one of them, and that's really what keeps you going, because otherwise doing this is way too difficult. But I think I, Jedi would probably have to be my favorite, just because of how it wrote itself really, really fast, and was just, geez, I've been a fan of Star Wars forever and ever and ever, and this was finally one where I just got to delve in as deep as I wanted to, and Lucasfilm was great in pretty much saying, knock yourself out. So.
So many of you will know the great writer Mike Resnick, who was a mentor to many authors and a great writer and editor. And he has a GoFundMe going right now to cover some medical expenses that he incurred in the last year. So A, I will plug his GoFundMe, and B, I will steal a piece of advice from him. He said, whenever anybody asks you what's your favorite book, your best book, anything at all, say the one that's easiest for them to go and buy. And so my favorite book is my most recent book, Quantum Night, in fine bookstores everywhere.
Mike's practical about that kind of thing. Yeah. I always have a different answer for this because I don't know. I just picked the one that's favorite at the moment. So for this one, I'm going to say the Spider-Man book I wrote for Marvel because it was like writing fan fiction, but they paid me.
Okay, so what is your favorite part of writing? Is it when you come up with your original concept, or when you type the end, or somewhere between those two? What is your favorite part of the process of actual writing?
Z, or Z as you would say down here, but it just gives the pinky a nice workout. All right, I went last, or second last. I'll go first, and I'll say it is not the writing. I'm not like my friend Kevin. He'll tell you how much he loves and his special process. I hate the process of creating the first draft. If you were a sculptor or you were an artist, you could go to what's a politically correct hobby store here in the States. There's a lot that are embroiled in difficulties right now. You go and you buy your lump of clay and get to work immediately. You go and buy your canvas and get to work immediately. We have to create our clay out of absolutely nothing except the brute force thoughts in our head. And that first draft for me is the part I hate. I love revising, and I love most of all doing research. So what Jim said here about he got to do fan fiction and they paid him for it, I love learning new things. I love researching, and the fact that at the end I can monetize the research by making a book based on it lets me support my hobby, which is just loving learning things.
I can't stand revision.
Yeah,
You're wrong. I can't stand revision. It's too much like being wrong. I don't like that. But seriously, I mean, kind of the way I write, I tend to. I'm kind of like one of those Japanese painters that'll sit and just stare at the canvas and stare and stare and stare and then just go whoosh, horse like that. But my process is like front loaded. So I've got to, before I write a chapter, I've got to be able to picture the whole thing in my head and move all the pieces around and have it in place, and then I just write it, and then that way my revision process is usually pretty light. But it also means front loading. It also means that it can take a long time to get things done. So
I would say for me to borrow a phrase from Christopher Priest, I really like the prestige. Not the prestige of being a writer, but that idea, it's a stage magician term. It's this idea that the reveal, the moment where everything comes together and you show something off. For me, and I think it's very common for writers, writing is hard. I do like the writing, I do like the planning, but all of that is still work. And while I enjoy my work, the moment that it's done, and instead of writing, I have written, and I can take it to somebody and I can get their reaction and watch them experience the reveal, the prestige, the moment where everything kind of locks together in a story. That is my favorite part. I think authors do share a lot with stage magicians. When the way that we foreshadow and the way that we try to hide reveals behind several layers of red herrings and things like this, so that moment that you just start to figure it out, and then boom, it happens in the book, and you're like, oh, I should have seen that. That's my favorite moment in writing, is sharing that with people.
Nice.
Wow. And I've realized that I've known Rob Sawyer for about 35 years, and we really should have been collaborating all this time, because we're a match made in heaven, because you do all the stuff that I don't like to do. I mean, to me, really, the making things up and doing the first draft, I mean, that's the fun part. And the
we only need one author photo between us.
Yeah, well, we do. And then, to me, taking that first draft that I've written and then doing the first edit on it, that's about as fun as a prostate exam. This is the Men of Fantasy panel.
For those exams, most of us are unconscious.
Your doctor likes to hit you too hard, I think. But no, I mean, I'm a plotter. I'm an inveterate plotter. I write these giant epic things that have 100 chapters and 34 different points of view, and I got to get everything all set up like in a blueprint. So I do that very, very carefully, and I love that part. To me, it's like an architect sketching blueprints, and you come up with something that works just right. But then once I got the outline down, then the next part is also really fun, because say chapter 35, the outline says it's a big sea battle between these 4 ships, and then a sea serpent shows up and destroys one of them. That's what the outline says. But then I get to be like the pantser and go, all right, I've got this chapter, I don't know anything about it except there's a naval battle and a sea serpent in the middle of it, so I'm just gonna make stuff up as I write it. And that's like when I was a kid, I used to tell stories to the other kids I babysat, so we would just make up Space 1999 adventures and things. And that's just really fun. And once the fun part's over, then you have to do like cleaning it up, and I don't like that at all.
Yeah, I think I'm with Brandon. I think that I really enjoy when you're setting all the dominoes in place and you have that moment where you know that there is a reader out there, and occasionally you actually know who that person is, who when they read this sentence will scream out loud and terrify everybody in their house. And I kind of live for that moment. They're never close enough to scream when I'm around, but you do get mail, and they will tell you about that experience. But knowing that you've crafted the story well, you've laid out all of those clues, you've led them down to this point, and they ought to see it coming, and then bang, it's there. You're right, it's exactly like being a magician, and that's just way cool.
Well, Kevin sort of led us into my next question, which is, are you a plotter or a pantser? And how does that impact your work?
I actually hate the term pantser. I hate the dichotomy because I think it's false. All plot comes from characters, and all events that form the plot force your characters to grow and adapt, and that's how the story comes together. I think that people who plot ahead of time are working to an outline, but rarely do we stick to that outline. And I think that people who think that they're going by the seat of their pants end up, after the first draft, having to find out what the outline is and revise backward. So it's just a question of when you're going to do that work. That's my opinion there. For me, it differs with every project. Fairly often, I love being able to outline the book from stem to stern and have a vague sense of where I'm going. But I've done plenty of projects where I'm outlining or only seeing 3 or 4 chapters from where I am. It just depends upon the project. The whole idea is to get the characters to lead you through the story, and once you're there, the other stuff really doesn't matter.
And I've had discussions with like inveterate creative pantsers that they want to just be following whatever their muse tells them. And they have criticized me saying, well, how can there be any creativity if you've got an outline there? It's like, dude, the creativity comes when you do the outline. I mean, that's everything goes when you're coming up with the outline. It all just depends on at what point you're being a pantser. And because I hate to rewrite, I don't like to write 10 chapters and then throw them away because I just didn't think about it ahead of time. So I like to have it all in my head before I go further on. But just one more of a pragmatic point, more for me and Mike and for Jim and his Spider-Man book. When you're working on media tie-in properties, you really do have to plot ahead of time. You have to give them a very detailed chapter by chapter by chapter so that they can approve everything that you're doing, tell you where it contradicts the action figure that they're trying to produce, and then forget that they approved it when you turn in your manuscript that follows the outline exactly.
I'm going to agree and disagree with Mike at the same time. It is a false dichotomy. It absolutely is. But the reason it, I think, is pervasive to discuss about this, because it is a useful imaginary construct, which we use a lot in the publishing industry and in writing. I think it is useful to kind of talk about these two modes of writing. The false dichotomy is that one person is one or the other, where most people are in between, and indeed most people are one or the other at various points in their they're writing on different books and things like that. I do prefer George Martin's terms for them, which are gardener and architect. I do think that kind of indicates a little better, but the reason the tool is useful is people who cringe at revision and people who cringe at having an outline people do tend to fall into one of those two just kind of instinctively. And you can know, for instance, that one tool, like for instance, a lot of people who consider themselves pantsers, who are gardeners, Stephen King is one of these, and George Martin himself is one of these, tend to have sometimes trouble with their endings, right? And you can kind of imagine this, right?
The fact of ending
Yeah,
something.
it is a lot of people. No, don't you put that evil on me. But a lot of people who are, and so if you naturally go that direction a little bit more, you can kind of plan for that a little bit and maybe try to use some of the plotting tools. Plotters, where they tend to have problems, is they stick to the outline too rigidly. They write the life out of their characters. So what happens is you have stilted characters who are following the plot rather than the person that they're growing to become as the story goes along. So both can be a foible, right? Both can be a crutch, but they can also both be useful. Where am I on this? Over the years, I've kind of come to understand that having a really solid world-building guide up front is really handy for me. I also like really tight endings where a lot of things come together, and because of that, I like to have a really strong outline before I start. I generally don't do very much work on my characters before I start. I start to discovery write and garden my characters, and then I'm constantly going back to the outline because a lot of times the people they're becoming, if I stick to that outline, they'll feel stilted. They'll feel like a cardboard cutout. They'll feel like somebody who's dancing on strings instead of somebody who has any autonomy. And so I have to be constantly then changing the outline to match who the people are becoming as I write the book. And this gives me a little bit of the best of both worlds when it's working. I have characters who do feel vibrant and alive, and I still can kind of keep control of that plot so I can tie it together the way I want.
Okay, so Jim just looked at me. So there's a famous cartoon that shows a guy who's just died. He's a writer. And he comes up to the pearly gates, and there's St. Peter, and St. Peter says, you're borderline, right? You wrote for Bane. No, I'm just kidding. You're borderline. That's a joke, folks. It's going to get worse. You're borderline. And you either go to heaven, you go to hell. So, and he said, which one would I prefer? And he said, I honestly don't know. Why don't I show him both? So he looks around heaven. Takes everybody around heaven. It's all people typing away madly on their computers. Boom, 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 boom. It feels kind of like at home. Goes down to hell, looks around. It's all people typing away madly on their computers. He says to St. Peter, I don't get it. What's the difference? He says, the difference is in heaven, they get published. So I think the other difference is you'll find a lot more plotters in heaven. My experience in talking to people, and Kevin was just mentioning how long I've known him, is noting somebody I just saw at a convention 2 weekends ago who I'd first seen 25 years ago at the WorldCon in Winnipeg, World Science Fiction in Winnipeg, telling me about his novel. He's still telling me about his novel 25 years later. And he's always got interesting character stuff, and he's always going down interesting byroads, but he has no idea what his destination is. So at the bare minimum, I think you have to know where you're going. You have to be heading in a direction with your writing. And pantsers who sit down, and Mike said, I don't like the term pantsers. Of course, it's short for seat of your pantsers. The only logical alternative is asses, if you don't want to use pantsers, right? Because that's what pantser is short for. It's short for your ass, sitting on your ass and flying along. I don't think that a beginning writer is well served to be told, just sit in front of a screen and see what happens. I think a beginning writer is best served to be told, this is hard work. You've got to think of it, as a job with a deliverable and figure out how you're going to get to that deliverable. And I love Bane. There's a little joke. I thought here, at least, because Bane is so loved at DragonCon, you'd appreciate a little Bane humor. I love Tony. I love so many of the Bane authors. It's all over epic Twitter now.
They're filming this, so...
Don't let me started about Tor authors. No. As one myself, right?
We've just seen the end of Rob Sawyer's
It's over.
career.
It's over.
That's right, that goes in your diary. His career died today.
I'm just curious, how many aspiring writers in here? How many? Okay. Lunatics. Okay, all right. You're not in a bad mood to be in. He's right. When you're getting started as a writer, and Brandon's also right. I've often compared writing a book to stage magician acts. And if you're going to be a stage magician, you have got an awful lot of things that you have to practice to such a degree that you can do them without thinking about them. You look at any master craftsman, a master woodworker, a master whatever. When one of those guys goes into his workroom and starts working, he knows what he's building, and he just starts building it. He's thinking about a lot of different things. But first, he had to be the guy who thought about, well, how do I make sure that all these lengths of wood are exactly the right length? How do I make sure they match up? How do I get these angles cut so that they match up together? There's lots and lots and lots and lots of little jobs that you just have to learn to be able to do really well to the point where you don't have to think about them anymore. And all of that stuff, I mean, it all falls into the rubric of basic writing craft, the things that you have to learn. It's like, look, you gotta learn from the people who have gone before you, because everybody out there right now who's buying professional stuff, they've learned, they know what it is, although they don't know that they know what it is, but they know. So you have to learn. This is how you introduce a character. This is how you establish tension. This is how you slow or increase the pace. This is all stuff that you have to practice. And practicing it sucks, and that's too bad. You have to do it if you want to be a writer. But once the good thing about that is it's all stuff you can just learn. I mean, it's seriously, it's not artistic stuff. You can learn to build a cabinet. If you want to, you can go learn to build a cabinet. You can learn to write a best-selling novel too, if you want to teach yourself. And unfortunately, pretty much, you got to teach yourself. There's a limited amount of what teachers can tell you. But definitely go out, and I mean, for the people that come and ask me, I say go pick up the Debbie Chester's the fantasy fiction formula. Debbie Chester was a professor at the University of Oklahoma, the School of Professional Writing. She's where I learned everything I needed to know about writing. So if you want to pick up her thoughts on it, and she talks all about storycraft, go pick up her book and take a look.
Listen to Writing Excuses.
You have written a book, or you're in the process of it, and you have a beta reader, or you have somebody who kind of looks over your shoulder. How do you develop that trust to hand a manuscript to another person and let them either praise it or shred it or somewhere between? How do you get to be that person, the beta reader or the critique group, and how do you as a writer make the best use of that entity?
Well, I married mine, which puts her. She has got a vested interest in making the book good, since she lives off of my earnings too. So she wants to have everything as best as it can be, and she goes over all of my manuscripts. She writes all over them, edits all over them, and we do have a guest bedroom in case we disagree on editing. I won't tell you which of us sleeps in the guest bedroom.
This was really hard for me, starting off. When I was a teenager and started writing my first books, I would type off the manuscripts, and then I would hide them, the chapter, behind the picture in my room, right, or under my mattress, right. I was hiding very different things as a teenage boy than others might have been, but I did not want anyone to find these. And I wrote multiple novels before I actually showed one to someone, just because. If you guys don't know my story, I wasn't a reader when I was a kid. I got into it when I was in junior high, and I was very nervous about the idea that I was probably pretty bad at this. Sometime in college, I started to mature a little bit more, and I started to hear some writing advice. And the writing advice that I heard was, your first few books are generally terrible. And for some writers, that probably would put more stress on them. For me, it relieved a lot, because I suddenly realized, oh wait, I'm not expected to be good at this yet. It's okay if it's bad. And that realization is, I think, a realization a lot of writers come to that's very liberating. For me, it was totally freeing. I could say, okay, now that I know I don't have to be good for several more books, I can start showing this around, have people tell me what is bad. I can know that it's going to be bad, and it won't be quite so hard. And indeed, that mindset worked for me. I started showing the books around to friends and things like that, started getting the feedback. One other thing that I found that was very useful, and I think is still very useful for writers, is if you're working on something else while you're sending that around, rather than waiting and counting the days till it comes back to you, when that manuscript comes back, if you've written something else in the meantime, you've given yourself a little distance and space, and then taking that criticism and that feedback becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, I actually don't use beta readers, mainly because a lot of stuff I'm doing is already under contract, so I just don't have time to do that. And if I'm doing a book for a company, say, well, when I was doing the World of Warcraft novel, that was for a release that was coming up, I literally couldn't have turned it over to beta readers no matter what I wanted to do. So I've never really developed using beta readers. But getting criticism back from editors still stings. I mean, it is still difficult. I don't particularly like it, because they should have seen my genius anyway. But you have to remember that everybody, I think, that you involve in that process is looking to make the book the best they possibly can make it, and you have to assume that case is true, and then go through and let them give you the opportunity to make it better than it even was. All of us need an outside perspective. And nowadays, one of the other things is that there are plenty of freelance editors out there that you can hire to take a look at this stuff, so that you have essentially a qualified beta reader. So you have somebody who knows what they're doing and is going to be able to give you sound advice, aside from having to work up and figure out people who are just going to tell you, oh, I loved it, versus things that, useful and actionable criticism with a book, which you need to be able to complete it.
I work with beta readers extensively. I write to a live audience of about 15 people. And so chapter by chapter, as they come out, people provide me with feedback. And I've got a feedback form that is split into 3 sections, and it's pretty simple. The first section is, what did you like? What did you dislike is the second section. And the third section is, did you have any questions? The reason for what did you like and what did you dislike is pretty simple. I need to gauge the audience's reaction to whatever I've just done. A lot of times I'll get dislikes that are like these huge dislikes, and I'll be like, good. Because that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to make the reader upset in this, what's going on in this scene, or other stuff like that. But the thing to remember is that the feedback that you get from the writer or from the beta reader is not necessarily the first thing you should look at. Is not actually what they're writing about specific things that they had issues with. That's secondary. The first thing you should look at is their emotional response to the writing that you just wrote, that you just turned out. The emotional response that they give you to a given scene, whether it made them laugh or it made them cry or whatever it was it did. Because at the end of the day, when you're writing drama, you've got to get people's emotions involved. So that's the first thing I look for in beta reading is, do I have a good emotional involvement in this chapter? And whether people like it a lot or hate it a lot, I win either way. So it's okay if people really, really hate something that I've just done. It means that it's working, I'm getting to you. Probably inspiring fury is not what you want to do on a regular basis, with your readers. But you do want to get them to give them that emotional involvement in the story that's going on. That's how you know. That's how you know you've got them involved. You're going to do well with this story. It's not anything they have to say about your writing, though. It's not about you. You can't let it be about you. You're making something. You need to see how it's going to hit the audience, and you need some lab rats to work with. Sorry. There's beta readers here, so I have to think about these things.
But selecting your lab rats is important. Your job as a writer is not to be blandly acceptable to everybody out there in the reading public. Your job is to be the favorite author of a narrow segment of the reading public. I write hard science fiction set in the present day or near future with a philosophical bent that is generally optimistic. You're either in for that ride or you're not. And if you're not, there's absolutely no point in somebody who loves dystopian fiction, for instance, telling me what they liked and didn't like, because I'm not writing for them. The problem with general writers groups at the beginning of a writer's career is you take this rough stone that has some really interesting sharp bits on it, and you throw it into the lapidary tumbler of a general critique group, and I don't like profanity, I don't like sex, I don't like that this happened, I don't get where that is going, and you take it, all those rough bits off, and you end up with a stone that you could swallow and go right through your GI tract and poop out without ever being aware that you had actually ingested it. You don't want your fiction to be smoothed down like that.
That's what all writers strive for.
This is also why you should, by the way, pants, because never start a metaphor. Plot, because never start a metaphor where you don't know where it's going. So the other thing you have to recognize is the people in your life. Kevin mentioned Rebecca, his wife, for instance. The people in your life, whether they're spouses or close friends, have a vested interest in keeping you happy. And you have to train them that in the long run, you will be happier if you actually sell the thing you're working on. The short run, the easiest thing, it's wonderful, it's brilliant, don't change a word, and make you feel good in the moment. But they have to be inculcated into the notion that 6 months down the road, when the thing hasn't sold or you've stalled out because you had no idea what to do with the rest of the piece, that you're going to be miserable. So they should be on the team with you who are looking for, in the long term, to make you happy by making the best work you can possibly do, not the short term just doling out praise to keep you happy in the moment.
There's another thing I want to throw in about beta readers is that is getting expert beta readers in certain subjects. All writers must beware if they ever write anything that has guns or horses. And if you're going to put guns or horses shooting guns or anything like that, you need to have somebody that knows those subjects to proofread your stuff, because you can write the most brilliant book ever and put the wrong caliber of bullet in a gun and you will be excoriated.
Or you can publish in Canada where nobody cares.
Yeah. Yeah, but your horses kill people with knives.
We got great horses.
Well, but also seriously, and I just kind of had this come at me with a major New York publisher, they're also strongly suggesting people have what they call sensitivity readers. If you have like a gay character, make sure that you have a sensitive gay reader. They're requiring this on especially YA writers. I won't make further comments on that.
If I can throw something on here, diverting a little bit back towards some things that Rob said. I really do like beta readers. I think they're very useful, but they can be very dangerous, particularly at the beginning of an author's career. So just let me throw out there, your job as a writer is generally not to do what beta readers say. It's to figure out what the reader will want and figure out if your book is not working for that reader. And a lot of times it won't be as a new writer. But a lot of times the things that are bothering the beta readers are not the actual problem. They're the symptoms of the problem. And this sort of thing that you have to train yourself and learn can be really difficult. Reading between the lines, so to speak, on what the feedback has been on a story can be really handy. I just had this on a book, and People were asking for more of a certain group of characters in a book, and were really upset that they weren't in there. And this was actually a problem with the promises at the beginning of the book, promising what style of book it would be, rather than going in and rewriting to add all of this in that they were asking for. I set up the book differently, and the next round of readers didn't have that problem because I wasn't promising something they weren't getting. And that's often a big problem with books that need revision.
And that's not just when you're looking at beta readers. I mean, when you have a book that goes out and you get feedback from just the general population, you really need to listen to those comments and look at what's going on beyond them. When you have a book and you get a bunch of readers saying it ended too quickly, that doesn't necessarily mean that you ended too quickly. What that can probably mean is you didn't go on too long until they got bored. So it's actually a very good thing, and you know that you've kept them hungry and they're gonna keep coming back. So you need to look at all of these comments, critically and figure out exactly what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and then figure out if that's in fact what you want to do as you work forward.
So do any of you belong to a writers group here on the panel? No.
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay,
Actually,
Brandon does.
yep.
All right. Some of us might have early in our careers, they did it really, so when Kevin and I were starting, and I'm sure some of the older guys here, it was really expensive to swap manuscripts with another person. You had to go to the photocopy shop, pay 10 cents a page, and ship it through the mail. And so the writers group is a fairly new phenomenon where it's easy to distribute your words to a large number of people. But that said, the people I know who have been in writers groups for decades, with a few exceptions, there are exceptions, are the ones who aren't getting anywhere. The trick of a writers group, or the trick of taking a creative writing course like the ones Kevin teaches now in Colorado, is for you to learn to see your work the same way other people see it. Everybody goes into a critique group and is full of recognizing what's wrong with every other manuscript that's handed around the table except their own. And you should cultivate that skill to be able to, you should be your own, not just alpha reader, that's the first person in house, but your first beta reader too. You should be able to look at it with fresh eyes. People ask me on the flip side, I do some editing, what's the most important skill an editor has to have? An editor has to be able to read a manuscript for the umpteenth time as if they're reading it for the first time and still go, oh yeah, that surprise works. Oh wow, it all comes together. Oh my God, I can't believe he just did that on the 8th reading of the manuscript. So make sure, if you do join a writer's group, that it doesn't become the cornerstone of your social life, but is actually serving a purpose. And my litmus test for you is when the people in your group are telling you things that now you already see clearly and either deliberately chosen to ignore or are going to correct anyways, it's time to bow out of that group.
I have a funny story to tell you about a friend of mine who was an editor and then became an agent. And then she got married, and I'm going to call her Judy just so she can remain anonymous, but her husband was a writer, and one day he came to her with his manuscript and handed it to her and said, I want you to read this. And I said to her, did he hand it to Judy? Judy, his wife, or Judy, the editor? And she said, he handed it to Judy, the wife, but Judy, the editor, read it. And now we're sleeping in separate bedrooms. Just saying. What do you do? What do you do when you have a sequence of scenes planned and certain things are supposed to happen, and you get to a point and you realize you need to do that, but it can't happen based on what you've written so far? How do you drop back 10 and punt to make that work, or to figure a way around it?
This would be a sports metaphor, wouldn't it?
I missed a very important football game last night, so I'm not in a mood. Because I was at DragonCon last night, and I missed a very important football game. Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, okay. So, for me as a hard science fiction writer, it has to pass my bullshit meter. And I reach points where sometimes I am stumped for weeks, because if I don't buy it, I know still 90% of my readers will buy it. They'll say, okay, Sawyer knows what he's doing. But for that 10% who isn't going to buy it, I am just stopped cold. I've got to work it through to an extent where I can plausibly believe it. Remember, the job of the science fiction writer isn't to find the most likely explanation of things out there in the universe or whatever. It's to find the most entertaining one that isn't easily gainsaid by what we already know. So I spend a lot of time when I get to a showstopper like that, and it's just brute force work. But if I have to go back, now at this stage of my career, it's less often that I have to do that. But if I had to go back 10 chapters and throw out 10 chapters because it wasn't going to pass the BS meter, then I will, absolutely. You have a contract, if you have a contract, you're lucky enough, it'll tell you how many words you have to deliver. It'll say, 100,000 for me, 400,000 for Brandon. It's just the way these things work. And you may overwrite by quite a significant amount. Everybody loves getting the deleted scenes for their favorite TV show on the Blu-ray or the DVD. You can see why they were all deleted, but it's fun to see them. Same thing with most novelists. There'll be stuff that just gotta throw it out. It just didn't earn its place in front of a vast audience.
For my last book, I cut out a Robert J. Sawyer sized book.
There you are.
From the manuscript.
And I'm publishing it under my name now to increase my stature.
No, it was 540,000 words, and the published version was 460. So it was 80,000 words got cut off of that book.
But some of them were the same words, weren't they?
Yeah. We tend to reuse words and letters quite a bit. It's kind of a crutch.
26 of them. I've had some back to the beta readers where I'll have everything all beautifully plotted and intricately. We'll have like this poignant scene where one of these characters gets killed, and there have been at least 2 times, maybe 3 times, when the beta readers staged a revolt, and a violent revolt at that they wouldn't let me kill the character. And I go, well, no, the character has to die. That's how the outline said. No, they wouldn't let me kill the character. And it was to the point where it got so ugly that I had to not kill the character. He got better. And in fact, one of those, in my Star Wars Jedi Academy trilogy, in the second book, the big Imperial Admiral villain, Admiral Dala, she died at the end of the second book. That was it. 2 books, she's done. And my beta readers hated it, that I needed to get her back. And I said, no, she dies. Lucasfilm approved it. And they said, no, you need to bring her back. And I fought and fought and fought, and finally I rescued her, and I think she's been in 43 other novels now. So that was the most cost-effective resuscitation.
But on that point, I always say if there had been beta readers in the time of Bambi, Bambi would have lived, and it would be an utterly forgotten work.
Bambi doesn't die, does he?
And there would be so many fewer traumatized people! We saw Bambi's mother die when they were 3 and blipped
Bambi's
out!
mother, I mean, yeah.
Yes! When they were 3 and blipped out about it. My gosh.
Oh dear, look the same.
No, I think for me,
I mean, they taste good.
I will yield my time back to Mr. Witcher.
Appropriately named. As you were saying.
As I was saying. Usually, at least for me, as the book is changing, as I'm going along, I'm making notes on the outline so that I rarely run into that position where I come up to a chapter of, what am I supposed to write today? Oh my God, this won't work. I've been seeing that disaster coming for a while. So usually, having had the warning, I kind of have figured out something new to do. And I think the real important thing is that you learn not to be afraid of the fact that your outline is warping. Because that means, as was being said before, writers who write strictly to the outline really have sterile novels. There is no serendipity, there is no growth of characters, spontaneous growth of characters or anything on that order. So as you're watching these characters grow and push along, generally that idea that you've had that was a sticking point here, if you really still need that to happen, You can push a little bit further in the future, lay a better framework for it, and make it work. Or you just find a better idea that will give you a similar effect, but has grown out of the way the story is going now. And so it's not, for me, it's not a very big crisis. It's very manageable.
Yeah, I would say for me, some similar things there, though it does happen very frequently. I will first add a caveat. Not every writer who writes directly to outline is going to have a sterile novel.
Right.
A lot writers learn different tools for making sure they don't have that. It's just a common problem for new writers who do. So let's make sure, don't go and read some author out there who said, wow, I just followed my outline exactly. It turned out great. Sometimes it does happen. It doesn't happen very often for me because of the way of my process I've built it to be, which is that one where I'm discovery writing or gardening my characters as I go along. And so what happens when I hit one of these problems, there's several responses here. The first one is, in the moment, I'm very focused on keeping momentum in my books, not stopping too long. And so what I will generally do is I'll try something in the next chapter. Usually I'm seeing it, 8 or so chapters ahead of time, and so I'll start laying the groundwork for how I'm going to change that. And I'll add a new character sometimes, just in, chapter 14, and pretend they've been there all along, right? And I will just, or I'll kill off a character and pretend they've been dead all along, or I'll, add this plot element into this, the major part of the world building that will need to be foreshadowed, and I just put it in the chapter and I see how it works, and I keep going forward. If it works, I just keep going with it. If it doesn't, the next chapter is going to have a different attempt to try to fix this. And oftentimes I'll throw that chapter away and write a new one in its place. But the idea that I don't want to get stopped. I don't want to lose the creative momentum. Writing is this weird thing where for a lot of us, not for everyone, but for a lot of us, the more we're doing it and the faster and more furious we're doing it, the better the writing gets. This is why it's sometimes annoying when someone is called a hack or things like this because they're writing too quickly. Because a lot of the great stories you'll find about the great books that were written happen where it's the writer's able to get in that zone, to get consumed entirely by the story, and their subconscious brain starts working on how to fix all of these problems, and the book just gets better and better the more immersed in it you are. Where books go wrong a lot of times, not for everyone, is when you get stopped, and then you get stopped. And then you start to stress about that chapter that needs to be right. And then you've spent 6 months not writing it, and suddenly it has to be even better because you've not spent 6 months writing it. And then suddenly it spirals into this kind of terrible writer's block disease thing that you just don't want to have happen. And so I just try to keep that momentum. And half the time, most of the time I will change my outline. And this came up because one of the characters is growing into someone who wouldn't do what the outline said. Once in a while, what happens is I need to rip out that character and put a new character in their place from the get-go that meshes better with the outline and what the other character's themes are becoming. And in that case, I'll put that character away and say, they can be in a different book in another time. So obviously it doesn't work for a sequel, but, not always is the answer to just to change the outline.
Can we get everybody on that?
Do you see the note?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. This is kind of a tough question to phrase and then a tough question to answer. But have you ever encountered a situation where you became so emotionally involved in what you were doing that you had to just step back from it and become detached? And how did you manage that, if that ever happened to you?
Happens to me on a fairly regular basis, although with feedback I'm getting. Occasionally I'll get feedback that just makes me furious. And I know when I get feedback that makes me furious, if there wasn't substance to it, I wouldn't feel threatened, I wouldn't feel afraid, so I wouldn't feel angry. That's there's something there. It's not necessarily directly what they're complaining about, but there's generally speaking, when somebody gives me some feedback that just makes me glower for 20 minutes, I'll be like, oh, yeah, they're right. There's something there, or I forgot this, or I didn't set this up properly. But when you are for the aspiring writers out there, when you're getting your feedback, if you get something that just makes you furious, stop and come back to it a day later and take another look at it and see if there isn't something there that they might have a point. You can often find yourself growing as a writer by doing that, although it does require you to take your anger and set it over to one side and to go use your brain instead. So,
Jim is certainly right, but to Nancy's point of actually when you're writing the stuff, certainly I have written scenes that have emotionally crippled me for a while after writing the scene.
oh, those are the best scenes.
They're the best scene. I think the best thing I ever wrote was in a novel called Humans, which is the middle of my Hominids, Humans, Hybrids, Neanderthal Parallax trilogy, where a person from a parallel Earth is looking at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and just trying to make sense of that wall of endless names of people who died pointlessly in Vietnam on the American side, let alone all the Vietnamese who died as well, and other people who died as well. And I mean, I was in tears writing it, which I wanted my readers to be when reading it. But that's when you know you're in the right job.
That covers it. That was
Well, I mean, there are the scenes where have a real emotional resonance to you, the writer, that you know it comes either out of some tragedy in your life or out of some experience you had. Now, face it, we're writing big, epic science fiction or fantasy. They're giant wars and galactic battles and Alderaan's being destroyed, and there's all kinds of crises. Our characters go through a lot of bad stuff. And everything, I mean, if they all have normal, quiet lives, you're not going to read the books. So you want the characters to go through all kinds of action and adventure and mayhem and tragedy. But there are sometimes as a writer when there's some incident that your character goes through that just hits you. And it's scary to write those like that. And I remember one of my big fantasies where I had one of my main characters was a sea captain who had found a puppy and had raised him, and this is many years later when he's all alone and his life has fallen apart and his dog's with him up in like this cabin up in a mountain valley, and the dog just comes up, lays his head on the guy's lap and breathes the last sigh and dies. And I wrote that a week after I had put my cat to sleep. And I was just weeping when I wrote that scene. But it came across because the readers who read it got it. And it was a very powerful scene. And I don't like to do that very often because it's really hard. But if you have that, you have to use it, because otherwise you're cheating your readers and you're cheating the work, because the work deserves it. And you have to have that sort of grounding sometimes, because we're writers, we're God, we're wiping out a country, we're burning that building down with 50 people inside it. You have to remember sometimes that even though they're imaginary, they're still people to your readers, and you're hurting them, you're ruining their lives. We do terrible things to our characters just to amuse you.
You monsters! You pay us for it!
Wow, you guys are really twisted. Part of our job is to go ahead and put all the readers through an emotional ringer. I mean, the books that you may say that you hate because they put you through an emotional ringer are books that you will read more than once. They are books that you will go back to. They are writers that you go back to. The books that you don't care about are books that do not move you in one way or another. And we cheat not only our characters, but we cheat you, the audience, if we're not willing to embrace those difficult emotional states and go ahead and deliver that to you. So, one of the things that I face in doing books is you'll come down to a chapter and you've got 5 or 6 characters. Someone has got to die in this chapter. It could be any of those characters. And for me, out of those characters, I choose the one I like the most. Because I know killing that character is going to hurt me the most, and I assume that it's going to hurt you guys the most. And it's because I want you to have that emotional experience. because not only is that part of writing the book, but that also balances out then the positive emotional experiences. It gives you that full roller coaster ride, which is what ultimately we want out of these books. That's how they engage us. That's why they stick with us.
Well, we got the 5-minute sign about 30 minutes ago. Maybe not quite 30 minutes, but for your last comments, I would like for you to tell us your best piece of writing advice, and then what your next project is, and how soon we can find it. Is that a hard question?
I already plugged my next project, the Oppenheimer Alternative, out for the 75th anniversary of the Trinity explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki next summer. One word. Everything else is meaningless bullshit. Right.
Don't take writing advice from somebody you wouldn't go to for advice about other important stuff. Skin Game's done. Or not Skin Game, Peace Talks is done. I do not yet know when it will be out. We have to wait for people to get back from vacation after this weekend at the publisher to start setting schedules, so.
My next book is Starsight, sequel to Skyward, coming out as while Stormlight 4 is in the works. You can follow the progress bar on my website. Goal is for next Christmas time, not this one, next one. Also, my booth is booth 1513, I think, and we've got leather-bound copies of my books there. We've got all kinds of t-shirts and patches and all sorts of cool swag there, so stop by there.
My advice would be think about writing like athletics, and I know that science fiction fans are just really big athletes most of the time. But to be an Olympic athlete, you've got to practice every day. Get your muscles stronger, get your speed better, get your technique better. That's what writing is like. Nobody sits down and writes a brilliant novel the first time. You got to practice at it. I'm at the Bard's Tower in the dealer's room. There's a lot of other authors there. My big new one is called Spine of the Dragon. It's a giant epic. I call it like Game of Thrones, only I'm going to finish mine. And the second book called Venge War, which was 218,000 words, and I'm now down to 180,000 words, so I'm about a half of a Sawyer out of it. That I've finished. I'm on the editing process right now. Kind of going back to the previous question, this was a really hard book for me to write because my stepson died the week I started outlining it, and my dad died the week I finished editing the first draft. So I hope the book turns out powerful.
The next book I have up is a Dark Souls novel, and I have no idea when it's coming out because it's a U.S.-Japanese publication. So, and just doing the contracts was a pain. So yeah, I have no idea there. My best writing advice is just sit down and write. If you want more than that, I have organized here at DragonCon 18 hours of writing classes down in Hanover AB. And so there's hourly sets of workshops, so you can go down, and a lot of other writers, Tim Zahn, Tim Powers, a lot of people are also teaching classes. And so you can just go down and find all sorts of different stuff down there.
Did you see I'm wearing a Dark Souls shirt?
No, I didn't.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
It's always an interesting thing. I think you get questions answered here that on this panel that nobody else asks, and that's because I have a kind of a warped mind anyway. So thank you so much. Thank you guys. You're amazing, and you certainly are stars.